That's what got distracted. So you're like drawing a big thing here and you can't get between there and there. Suddenly just a shadow appears.
So it's like 4 o'clock and we're just going to roll. It's the last presentation of the day. We're happy that anybody bothered to show up. Thank you. You are the true pioneers. So this is the two Chris's. I'm Chris Larsen, this is Chris Mills. We're both researchers with Blue Coat. And this is basically a blue team talk. The overall theme is places to hide. And so think of this as the why our job is hard talk, and by our, I mean the good guys in general. And so if you want to take these slides later and use that and go to your boss, this is why I need a raise. That's kind of what it's for, all right? So we're going to talk about a bunch of specific things or techniques, places that the bad guys use to hide, to make life harder. And I was telling Chris, the interesting thing is for me is that most of this stuff the bad guys didn't have to build. It's kind of like, it reminds me of the room in Hogwarts, the room of requirements, where whatever you need, the room gives you. And a lot of this stuff, it's like the bad guys really needed something, and the internet provided it for them. And that'll be a theme that comes up over and over again. All right, so these are research vignettes, and I'll try to identify what we've actually published and what we haven't, and where to go to find it if it's interesting. And it's basically stuff to worry about, because you make this discovery and it's like, oh dang, right? There's one more thing I have to worry about. So the first one we call one-hit wonders. And so this research came from what we call the most interesting part of the web. So for us, that's the stuff that we don't have classified in the database already, right, in the basic web filtering database. So things that come in that aren't yet in the database, like it's a new site or it's out in the weeds somewhere, you go, okay, that's interesting, right? That's where the good stuff, the bad stuff is likely to be happening, right? So on a recent day, we have a system that tracks the not in the database stuff. This was like a year ago when we did this particular slide. So 6 million things that are active that day in the traffic logs that are not yet in the database. And if you start breaking these down by traffic in normal and not normal, the PhD who was building the machine classification system for this said, okay, I'm willing to take a stab at saying what something is when I see the third request. And so I was looking at the stats, it's like, John, there's 2/3 of the things that have 1 or 2 requests. And that's it. And he says, yeah, so I ignore those. Like, that's most of the stuff, right? And so that's 4 million things that only had 1 or 2 requests worldwide in 24 hours. Like, man, what's going on in there? So the first thing we did is try to segment this by age, the age of the host. And so the light colored segments now are the things that are new that day. So they're not just not in the database, but they've never been seen before. They're brand new that day. And so what you end up with is basically, it's an 8 to 1 likelihood that if you give me something new, it's really low traffic, right? So now, all right, what do you know about this thing? It's brand new, and it's got 1 request worldwide. So there's a lot of talk right now in the security space. A few years ago, it was big data, right? And now it's AI, because that's how you have to deal with big data, because by definition, big data can't be consumed by humans. It's too big. And so a lot of the talk is about using AI or machine learning to find anomalies, right? And the idea is that your network traffic is mostly this big pile of good, big haystack of good, and you've got a few needles of evil. And so all you have to do is find those anomalies. And what the data is telling us is that there are a whole lot of anomalies. All right. This is a big enough thing that we submitted a separate research paper to RSA to say, what do you do when you have a whole haystack of anomalies? Where do you start, right? Hopefully they'll pick that up. Sibling research, the one-day wonders. And yes, Chris will get to talk at some point, right, in case you're wondering. So one-day wonders was looking more at the question of this for anomaly detection, right? What's normal and what isn't. So we're building a model of what's normal, looking at traffic levels. And if you think about like the really big internet properties, their normal is a ton of traffic all day, every day. But most sites aren't that big. And so if you look at like what's normal for all of the millions of other sites on the web, it's sort of be like our version of Alexa, only we have a whole lot more data points than Alexa does, so let's build one. So for this research, we were looking at a 90-day window of all of our traffic, most of which is already going to be in the database. So a lot of it's going to be Google and Facebook and Twitter and those really big sites, right? But in a 90-day period, there were over 660 million unique hosts. And the little asterisk, I forgot to say that, I whacked me on the first slide. Hosts had as an asterisk. And so that's either a subdomain, a domain, or an IP. Whatever the base of the URL was, that's the host, okay? So 660 million unique hosts, and this was what made us go. And I love things that surprise me, because I think if this surprises me, and I work in this space, then it's probably going to be interesting to other people too. So this blew us away, and of course we had to say, well, what's going on in these sites that live less than a day? And the good news is that most of and there is a white paper on this on our website from last year. So but anyway, the good news is most of this is normal. It's not abnormal after all, because 6 of the top 10 parent hosts of most of these things are content delivery networks. So the big offender is Google. gstatic.com is Google's image server domain. And they make these really hairy subdomains, these unique subdomains, that apparently encode stuff like the user's geo, the session ID, stuff like that, so that Google can tell which image server somewhere in the world should be used to send the image for this request. And they must work really well because they do so much of it. But there are 6 of the top 10 are CDNs that do that. They generate these big, long, and if you're familiar with DGA, domain generation algorithms for botnets, where they just generate these random-looking domains, these subdomains look like they were bot-generated. But no, they're just computer-generated, and they're being used legitimately. The other 4 of the top 10 were free blog hosts, like Tumblr and Blogspot, because they encode the name of the blog, the name of the site, if you will, is the subdomain on tumblr.com or blogspot.com. So what this is saying is there are literally millions of blogs that are phenomenally unpopular, right? That you make this little blog about whatever, you tell your friend goes there, right? Bluecoat sees, look, we had traffic to this Tumblr site, and then crickets for the next 90 days.
So we can see how loyal your friends are.
Yes, and what does it say? Most people do not have loyal friends in the blogosphere, right? Okay, now, if you go beyond the top 10 that are legitimate and safe, you hit bad stuff.
And this right here is an example of Angler exploit kit. So the decabest.com is your compromised domain. It's a legitimate domain, and if you go there directly, it looks like a normal domain. But it had 10, 20, sometimes even 100 different subdomains that were probably only active for less than 24 hours. And they would get tons and tons of hits for like 18 hours and then disappear because they would just rotate through abusing the same domain over and over and over again.
Then it's not just Angler, right? There's a couple other exploit kits that also do this because it's the fun technique.
Angler is the biggest right now. Neutrino also does it. We've seen similar things with like Kulas, and it makes it very difficult to track.
Yeah. No, it's not fast fluxing. It's like that. Fast fluxing is where you have one domain and you're fast fluxing the IP it resolves to make life hard. This is fast fluxing the subdomain, right? So you'll crank out a subdomain, use it for a few minutes, and then crank out another one. And so typical so the way you stop fast fluxing is if you're a web filter, you don't try to block IPs, you try to block the domain because the domain isn't changing. So that guy say, wow, we can fool that because we'll just change the host, right? We'll change the subdomain. Each subdomain that's unique is a different host. And like you said, the parent domain there will sometimes be a legitimate domain where You don't know. Did the domain admin leak his password somehow, and so now the bad guys can log in to his internet host and generate new records? Or a lot of these are parked. If you go to the root domain, it's just parked on GoDaddy, and so, okay, did the bad guy did a legitimate guy set it up, and his GoDaddy password is held by the bad? The things that make the cloud attractive to the good guys also make the cloud attractive for the bad guys. The bad guys did not have to build Amazon or Cloudflare or SoftLayer or Rackspace. Again, the internet provides, and the bad guys can say, thank you, we can use that. That makes our life easier. As a bonus, no one is going to block Amazon. Not just Amazon.com, but the Amazon space, because it's Amazon. It's legitimate. And there's lots of stuff. I mean, there are all these big legitimate organizations setting up sites in Amazon, and so you can't just block the whole space. You have to go in and weed out the bad guys one by one.
And even 2 years ago, we considered Amazon's EC2 hosting. We'd see something on there, and it's like, oh, we can't touch that. We'd cause way too much collateral. But nowadays, it's like, we probably have to. We can't afford to leave certain IPs, even if they're Amazon cloud hosting. We can't afford to just let them run wild.
Basically makes the good guys have to dance faster. And I said, this is unpublished research. We have not gone in and normalized for something as basic as we really shouldn't be showing pi sections calling Amazon evil, right? And it's irresponsible, but this is a hacking conference. Irresponsibility is our middle name. But the idea is that you need to normalize for the size of the IP space, right, that Amazon has before you could say Amazon is more or less bad than somebody else. And yes, we know that Cloudflare is not actually hosting content, but externally that's how it appears. The sites look like they're on a Cloudflare IP, so we treat them as a provider. Yes, question? Yes. So the comment was that they've been tracking an attack against the university, and Amazon is a very responsive vendor. If you report abuse to them, they jump on it pretty quick. Cloudflare less so. Apologies if there's anybody from Cloudflare here, but did you want to talk about like the specific kinds of stuff, or we already covered that?
No, we'll go over this. This is an example of CryptoWall traffic being hosted on eduvantage.com. At the time, this was just a parked domain sitting on Amazon's EC2 server, but it was spitting out and it was using hundreds of hits of CNC traffic, and this was just churning out loads and loads of traffic. And if you check the IP, it was an Amazon-owned IP, and this was the only traffic there. So this one was easier because however they gained access to it, they could have bought their own IP on EC2 or compromised somebody else's. CryptoWall was using it as a C2 server. But with that, we can block it now, but in the future, that IP might go back into their pool and might get distributed to somebody else's, which makes it a lot more difficult to track and always keep on top of.
By the way, there was a really cool research article from another company published a couple weeks ago that looked into the question of, since it is so easy for a good guy to spin up a domain on Amazon and to use it for a project and then abandon it, what happens to those things after they're abandoned? Okay, so if you think about this, if I'm big corporation X and I have a team that's doing a project and we create a subdomain called project.bigcorporationx.com, and I've pointed project to resolve to that Amazon IP, when I shut down my project, the Amazon server goes away. If I forget to remove the DNS entry, I now have a subdomain on my domain, and it's an authoritative DNS server telling the internet that it's still mapping to that Amazon IP. So now if I can get a site on that IP, I can create a page that looks like corporationx.com, and Corporation X's DNS server is going to tell the world that yes, project.corporationx.com is right there, and it looks like that. I mean, it's a perfect phishing vehicle, right? Or other kind of brand abuse. And it's like, oops, you got to clean up after yourself.
And it's really easy to set up, thanks to Amazon Cloud Hub.
And so they did some research where they looked at a bunch of Amazon IPs and then did reverse DNS lookups to see what domains are out there that still have subdomains that think they resolve there. Right? More stuff to worry about. IDNs and TLDs. This is where Chris has to keep me on task, or I will talk your ear off. So if you think about top-level domains, right? 1985, we get the World Wide Web up and running, and we have 6 3-letter top-level domains and a bunch of 2-letter country codes. All right? And it stays this way for more than a decade. So in 1998, we add few new TLDs. And if you're like most people, you've run into .info and .biz. You may have seen a .name or a .pro, but like most people have not run into these. None of them really, other than .info, never really got widespread use. And it's more famous for abuse than good usage. And so there were a couple other years where they added a few more. In 2011, they added .xxx for porn sites. And that got in the news. That was newsworthy. Porn always is newsworthy. But if you're like me, you can still fit this into your brain. Okay? And then the internet went nuts a few years ago. So if I were to ask, how many legitimate, valid TLDs are in use on the internet today? And I said, is it more or less than 500? 600? 700? 800? 900? We passed 1,000 valid TLDs in use in July this year. And it's ramping up. Okay, so it looks kind of like this, all right? And this is just the A through C's from months ago. And so what happened is we noticed that one day I saw some .country URLs in the logs. I think it was some spam. There's some kind of malicious traffic. I'm like, .country, I haven't seen that one before. So I went in and I was actually curious, and I pulled our logs for all of the .country traffic we had over the past week, wondering how many good domains there were mixed in with the spam, and the answer was 0. So like every domain, active domain on .country that week was evil in some way. So we wrote a blog post and said, hey, you should block .country, everything .country at your gateway. There is nothing worth going there on .country. The whole TLD space is bad. So we actually did a report 2 months ago, and we named the top 10 shady TLDs. We got a lot of flack initially for .zip. Anybody hear about that? Happens. And that's the traffic that we're seeing in our logs, is all of these requests for .zip URLs. Okay, they don't resolve. A lot of them have really interesting names, like invoice.pdf.zip. Okay, if that URL, again, this is a URL, it's not a file name, it's a URL because it's in the web, all right? It's in the web traffic. What are you supposed to do with that if you're a web security company? You block it because it doesn't exist and it sure looks malicious, right? And that's your only way to signal, hey, something's wrong here. That was a spam email attachment, I guarantee it, but somehow it leaked out of the email client as a web request. Also, we have security teams at a number of very big organizations that know their stuff, and periodically, like daily, they'll send us lists of bad IPs, bad domains. We've seen this being used in malicious traffic. Blue Coat, please put this in your database. And guess what that feed has in it sometimes? .zip URLs. Okay? So if we have a security team at a major financial institution telling us that blah blah .zip is a malicious URL, it goes in the database. So the point of this is, we also got flack for saying that 100% of .review is evil. Okay, we're not saying that every domain on .review exhaustively is evil or malicious or shady in some way. What we're saying is that everything that we have rated in our database has a bad rating. Okay, that's 100% defensible because it's a simple database query. It says pull all of the ratings with the .review extension, and if the category is malware, botnet, suspicious, spam, scam, potentially unwanted software, or phishing, then it's bad. And 100% of the .reviews in our database at that time had one of those categories. But it's scary when you look and you think there's a whole bunch of TLDs where more than 95% of everything that we have, that's come to our attention, shall we say, has a bad rating. Now the ratings are fluid, they do change, and so if we pull this a couple months later, this is what it looks like. .zip is no longer 100% because I went in and rated the one Google domain that's legitimate as technology, and so now it's not 100% anymore. But this is kind of what it looks like. And the point is, but some of these dropped out, and there is a bunch of new ones. There's always new ones coming in. .accountant, okay? It's your free takeaway from SaintCon. You can go home and block .accountant with impunity. It's all bad right now. All right, we don't have time to go into shady IDNs, but basically the idea here is there's this thing called Unicode that is the universal character coding system. So it contains every alphabetic and pictographic symbol from every human language ever. It's got Klingon in there. Not the Klingon written in English letters, ASCII letters, but the Klingon script that they developed for the movies to put on labels on things on the Klingon warship as you're walking through, that the guy took from an ancient Tibetan alphabet because the letters had these little jaggedy points, and he thought that's what the Klingons would like, a language that looks like it's written with knife blades, right? So that's in there, all right? There's some Tolkien stuff in there, all right? There's all these dead alphabets and things. And the problem is you can mix and match. So if you look at the Wikipedia examples, there's 2 wikipedia.orgs there. And when this started to be used in the early 2000s, it was a recognized problem that you could have all sorts of interesting phishing and brand attacks if you mixed and matched the letters. So one of those wikipedia.orgs, if you copied it and pasted it from the slide into your browser address bar, it would go to wikipedia.org. I think it's the first one, I'm not sure. The other one doesn't, because only the W, the K, and the D are ASCII letters. The others are all Cyrillic alphabet equivalents. So one of the things they'll do is the good registrars will try to block you from mixing other alphabets with ASCII. So if you try to submit a full-on Russian domain name, they're happy with that. But if you have some Russian characters sneaked into an otherwise ASCII name, they're supposed to block that. They don't always. Okay? So if you look at the Blue Code example, that's actually not a reserved trademark symbol. That's illegal. ASCII part, and then everything after the dash, the next dash, is the Unicode part, and it's this weird, totally funky encoding system. But anyway, there are all kinds of games you could play, and when we went in and looked, this really started getting used in the late 2000s, and we had kind of ignored it because we'd gone in and looked to make sure our tools could handle Punicode and Unicode forms, okay? So you do that first, right? That's the first law of IT, is don't break things, right? So you want to make sure your systems can handle it. And then you look as security guys to say, are the bad guys doing that kind of stuff? No, they're not in 2010. There were some warnings out there that watch out for attacks like this, but it's not happening yet. So we kind of ignored it. And then we saw in 2012 and 2013, that one of our automated tools that found bad sites and put them in the database had been dutifully putting tens of thousands of bad, and they were malicious Unicode or IDN names into the database. Interestingly, when we presented that at RSA at the beginning of 2014, and the usage of bad stuff plummeted, and it's trending back up this year. So again, the bad guys didn't create Unicode, they didn't create Punicode, but they're there to take advantage of it. They didn't register all of those TLDs. It costs $185,000 to apply to register a top-level domain. I guarantee you the bad guys are not registering top-level domains like that, but they're happy to take advantage. .science was giving away free domain registrations in .science. If you do that, I guarantee you the bad guys will be registering .science domains, and that's why they're consistently in the top 10.
And we've seen that quite a bit now.
Yeah. Okay, mobile.
So mobile is, as with most things in security, very muddy.
Muddy.
This is in our database where we're going and looking for malicious APKs. And as you can see, this is month by month. It was very, very little until around November 2014. And then December, January, it just rockets. We're suddenly rating tens of thousands of malicious APKs.
So how many years has the security industry in general been trying to scare corporate America with the mobile malware tsunami is coming? This has been going at least 3 or 4 years, right? Well, it actually hit in January. So on the one hand, yes, we finally got the mobile malware tsunami and the world is going to end. But then
on the other hand, you have Verizon's 2015 DBIR report, and they even call out, I've got 99 problems, and mobile malware isn't even 1% of them. They go so far as to just downplay mobile malware very significantly. They say most of the stuff's annoyance on Android, but that's on average 0.03% of smartphones per week. So it's just on Verizon's network, it's just so tiny, it's hardly even worth mentioning.
Really rare to actually see scary malware on a mobile phone.
Yeah, I mean, there's the stuff that happens where it's pop-up ads, but that's not trying to steal your contacts and spam out malicious information.
And so, we tell people, don't jailbreak your phone. Don't download stuff from sites other than the official Apple Store or the Google Play site, right? Download your apps from official sites, official sources. Don't jailbreak your phone, and you're okay. And you generally are. And don't live in Russia or China. You're okay, because that's where most of this. It's almost all Android. It's almost all showing up over in those two countries. So on the one hand, lots of malicious Android samples showing up. On the other hand, it's not so severe. So you're like, okay, where do we go?
But then on the gripping hand, since the Verizon...
Who gets that reference? Who's this old sci-fi geek? This is from The Mote in God's Eye by Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell. So there's an alien race called the Motes, and they have 3 arms. 2 of the arms are small and have very dexterous fingers. Those are for delicate tasks. Then the other arm grows out of their chest, and it's this big honking thing that it's a vice. It holds things. So in their language, they have an expression that says, on the one hand, on the other hand, on the gripping hand.
And it actually works rather well for this situation, because since Verizon released their DBIR report, we've seen 2 major mobile malware threats emerge. The first being stage fright, which was theoretical, where a researcher found a problem where you could send a video MMS message, and you could exploit in part of the stage fright library, which is what it's called that.
It's in every version of Android.
And it's in every version of Android. And you could do remote code execution, which is exactly what you want. But then,
so that was the big news right before Black Hat, right? So everyone here has heard of stage fright, and if you're like me, that was the first time that I felt like, okay, it's time to sit down with my wife and children, all of whom have Android smartphones, and have a talk about security. And the scary part about stage fright is it didn't require the user to fall for the MMS and click it. Just arriving on the phone was enough. I mean, it was scary enough that at least one of the major European telecoms blocked all MMS traffic on their network when this was announced. For like a week, there was no MMS traffic there until they could get a handle on, okay, are there actually attacks in the wild using this? Are patches coming? And for me, that was scary. It's the first time I had to say, well, maybe I should have bought iPhones for all of my kids instead of Android phones. For me, that was a game changer.
And Google responded pretty quickly, saying they would patch stuff. But the problem with Android is that lots of the times it's not Google's say in when something gets patched. Lots of OEMs have their own patch schedule, and you rely on them to actually push out updates to your phone. And if you've got an old phone, they don't want to push out updates. They'd rather you just buy
a new one. Yeah.
Right. And so they don't want to actually update. So this is a threat that is in all Android phones. All of Google's phones got patched against it relatively quickly.
Samsung was really aggressive to patch theirs, and not just the current models, but to go back and push patches for the older ones. But other manufacturers, your mileage may vary.
Right, and so you don't really know if your device is protected unless you actually go out and look.
Also, it turned out after Black Hat that the patches that the guy who discovered this was a good citizen. He submitted patches for the vulnerabilities he found back to the Android code base, and they were incorporated. It turned out after Black Hat that other researchers were able to go in and show that not all of those patches were successful in totally closing the hole. There were ways around some of them. So we've still not seen a worldwide epidemic of dead and dying Android phones because of stage fright, but like for me, that was the first time that I actually worried about what was coming into my Android phone. Okay, the other one.
Yeah, and then
the second one has nothing to do with stage fright.
It's called PinLock.
PinLocker.
It's a threat.
PinLocker, have you heard of PinLocker?
Anyone heard of it?
No? Okay, go ahead. Hit him with it. Hit him with PinLocker.
It was a threat that people would get on their phones either through bad APKs. So, stick to the store. Some people don't. You get PinLocker.
It was porn browsing.
Mostly.
They're typically served what they thought was a porn video, but it was an APK.
It'd run, and if you've got your phone jailbroken, or if you have the option in Android, you have it checked that you can install third-party APKs. It would install, and it would change the PIN on your phone.
Yeah, that's how it locked your phone. It changed the PIN. And you were literally locked out of your phone unless you wanted to try to guess all the possible PIN combinations.
And it was like ransomware. It held your phone ransom.
The first really nasty, successful Android ransomware. All the other stuff you could recover from usually just by rebooting your phone.
And this was an actual legitimate lockdown on your phone because it legitimately changed your PIN to a random 4-digit.
Random number. The bad guys did not know what they had changed your PIN to.
They didn't want to go to the effort to actually record it.
It's too much work.
And they change it, send you
That's why this slide is funny, okay? It's because it was a random PIN that you ended up with. So you had to do a factory reset, and there goes your data.
So they were holding your data hostage. You can factory reset, but how many people have all of the photos they have backed up all the time? Smart people, yes, but not. That's a very small percentage of Android phone users would actually be up to date with backups.
So ransomware in general, if you look at the trajectory of dumb and stupid ransomware in the early days to the stuff like CryptoLocker and the others that do it right, it's easy to look at ransomware on the mobiles and project the same kind of curve. So it's like sometime in 2016, we're going to see a CryptoLocker style
And it would not even go through the submission process again. You would say, oh, look, it's the same thing, minor update, but then you could basically add whatever you wanted.
I apologize that my cool encryption text didn't show up. LibreOffice is pretty good, but it can't quite handle all of the characters that it needs to. Anyway, so on mobile malware, you still follow the golden rules. Don't jailbreak your phone, download from official sources, and don't live in China or Russia. And you're still pretty safe. But it's easy to worry about the trend is that the mobile malware is getting better, even though Verizon is still right. It hasn't really been used in a major attack yet. It's still more of a individual user problem and worry. So encrypted traffic. Okay, so if you look at, I mentioned our version of Alexa. So if you look at the top 50 sites that show up in our traffic, it's the ones you'd expect. Of those, most of those now use HTTPS by default. This is largely thanks to Edward Snowden and the NSA, neither of whom were created by the bad guys. But the hysteria around privacy and snooping and spying has pushed a lot of traffic to HTTPS. There are growing calls for running everything over HTTPS. Currently, the only popular sites that are high traffic sites that don't force HTTPS by default are things like ESPN and CNN, and they're news and media. They figure that there's nothing worth spying on in their traffic or it's too much hassle. But the trend is going that way. So if you start to look at, I think like 10 years ago, the only HTTPS traffic in a typical organization's network would be if you were going to a site where you could actually buy something and you went to the shopping cart page, they would switch to HTTPS and tell you to look for the little padlock, and that's how you knew that your credit card data was safe. But that's like less than 1% of your web traffic. Even on the shopping sites, even like in Amazon, you'd be all HTTP up to that point, and then you just pop in there to do your order, right? Now, it's pretty common to hear, I'd say 30% is probably the average for a typical organization. 40% is very common for a lot of organizations. That 40% of our traffic now leaving our network is HTTPS. We have no idea what's in there. I've heard as high as 50, and that's kind of the trend. It's easy to look at calls to encrypt everything and say, you know, in a couple years, 100% of your web traffic may be HTTPS. So there's two problems now if you're a defender, you're trying to keep the network safe. Any malware that can get in to the HTTPS stream coming in is invisible to whatever solutions you have in place to look for malware. Your sandbox can't find malware in SSL traffic. Your IDS can't see patterns to flag in the traffic, okay? And if you have an infection already in your network, and the bot or whatever the malware is phoning home for instructions or exfiltrating data, if that's in an HTTPS stream, again, you're blind to whatever that is. It's HTTPS. There's bits going out of my network. HTTPS, though, it must be safe, must be secure. And so our marketing used to come to me and say, Chris, we need some scary stories about malware attacking via HTTPS so we can sell more stuff. Like, there isn't any. Well, other than every now and then sort of randomly the bad guys will get lucky and hack a site that happens to have SSL certificate, and then if there's an HTTPS, you know, accidentally it might happen, but no, the bad guys are not doing this. Now, malware traffic in the botnet, once they're infected, yeah, there's plenty of stuff, but that wasn't exciting for them. So I had to, and I had to change my tune though, but if you think about it, if you are a bad guy and you wanted to attack over HTTPS, the idea is attractive because I'm going to bypass a lot of defenses. But to actually do it, I have to buy a certificate. And it's got to match, it's got to be from a trusted authority, it's got to match the domain name I've set up. And if you think about back to the one-day wonder research, I'm only going to get to use that domain probably for a few hours before the good guys all block it. They'll know it's, you know, it'll leak out that it's bad. And so that's a lot of work to go to and money. You know, I can't just use stolen credit cards, the SSL cert providers, you know, I don't get it right away. There's time for them to discover that, wait, that card is invalid. So, and if I just do a self-signed certificate, the browser's going to throw a warning. Yeah, most users will just click through the warning, right? But still, some users, that will my victim pool down a bit. And so, yeah, I'm just not going to worry. The attacks are simpler and less hassle for me as the bad guy if I don't worry about HTTPS. But last year we started to see a lot more attacks where the payload was on a file sharing site. So there were a lot of spams that came. This is primarily spam, but there were other things too, where you'd have a link to a Dropbox. Well, we asked for a show of hands. Whose organization blocks? Nobody blocks Dropbox. It's like oh, there's one. Okay, there are a couple places that will say no. That there could be anything coming down from there. We're not going to allow anything onto our network, and we want to have better control over we don't want our employees like putting stuff in a box because we can't see what it is, and we don't want them leaking proprietary information, right? So, but generally the trend is getting away from blocking that. And like I said, there's also stuff on various clouds. Well, guess what? All of those have HTTPS by default because you're not going to use a service like Dropbox if it didn't give you HTTPS because then it's not secure, right? So the bad guys didn't build any of that, but they're happy to use that because it makes it easy, you know, and because people trust the URLs and because they get free HTTPS in it. The other thing was we're seeing more second stage malware. So there's always been black hat services you could pay to have payloads installed on hacked computers. This really took off with CryptoLocker because the economics of ransomware make it very appealing to you. If you're getting a 10, 15, 20% conversion ratio on your victims who will cave in and pay the ransom, you can do the math and say if it costs me $5 to put a guaranteed install of my ransomware on a computer, and I'm charging a $100 ransom, and percent of those victims that I put it on are going to, cave in and pay the ransom, I'm printing money, right? So the ransomware with CryptoLocker was what really showed that the economics worked, and so it took off. Also, there's malware called Dire that's like the major banking Trojan in the world for the last couple of years. And it's been using a two-step approach where you first get a small piece of malware called Eupatre, and all Eupatre's job is we've established a foothold on the target computer. Now I'm going to go out and pull down the real payload. It's easier for the bad guy to get a small little payload because you can fit that into like some shell code, right? You can't fit a 1 megabyte malware thing as your shell code. It's too big, right? So it's easier to get a little installer, but then that guy, and it can use HTTPS to pull something down. Because when it goes out and pulls something down, that whole TLS handshake that would have happened browser, like if you go to one of the URLs directly, HTTPS, your browser is going to throw a warning. It'll either be an expired or a self-signed or a non-matching or otherwise invalid certificate. But when the loader is what's going out and pulling it down, it's going to ignore all of the handshake errors. It doesn't care. It's not doing it to authenticate the site like a normal human would do. It's doing it to hide the payload. And so there's no, because it's not happening in the background, there's no warning for the user. Okay, so abuse.ch, these were the Zeus tracker guys back when Zeus was the big banking malware threat. And so it's a couple of researchers in Switzerland. So in May of 2014, they added SSL BL, so SSL blacklist as a subdomain, and they started tracking SSL certificates that were being used by malware families. And as of March, when I looked at this, they had 588 certs. As of September, they were up to 702 certs. The cool thing is they list the malware families that are using these. Okay, and there's basically 24 or so different malware families that are using HTTPS for their command and control traffic. The thing that was interesting, though, is back in March, when they had 588 certificates listed, most of those were for Dire. And when I looked at the 702, there's no Dire. I finally realized, wait, Dire's missing. Dire should be there, even if Dire had stopped using this, it should still be there for historical reasons. And then I saw the little footnote that said, if you want the Dire list, it's over here. There's a separate link. So I clicked the link. It's a 27 megabyte CSV file with over 300,000 SSL certificates listed in it. Because Dire is now issuing self-signed certificates about every 5 minutes. That's how rapidly they're rolling these out to prevent this kind of service from being useful. We're going to skip the word, Brian. Time to start going fast. So CTB Locker was one of the ransomware families. And if you look at each stage of that attack, it was using HTTPS URLs to download the payload. The payload was a custom encrypted blob. It would encrypt your files with elliptic curve. The command and control is via Tor, and payment is Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency. So 5 flavors. Everything about this involved some kind of encryption. Bad guys love it. And that's where
built to be an entire network layer that's anonymous. So you can do things like file transfer, email, chat, and the I2P project was meant for whistleblowers, political dissidents, to try to protect them, and so they can, we can clean up the world through.
the bad guys didn't invent Bitcoin. They didn't invent Tor. They didn't invent I2P. They didn't invent elliptic curve cryptography. Right? They didn't have to build any of that. The requirements room provided it for them.
But like I2P being an entirely anonymous network layer is wonderful. You can do whatever you want on whatever port you want in complete anonymity. And so one of our researchers, Andrew Brandt, discovered it.
Next door, speaking now, by the way.
He discovered it in February, and it was rudimentary, buggy, but it existed. But by March, they had figured it out, and it was working well. and it was going through, as you can see here, it's all of this I2P traffic. And so it's like going to Tor, where I have no idea where it's coming from or where it's going.
Yeah, he didn't know what it was either. He had to Google it.
And the scary part about this traffic is that this traffic was also SSL encrypted. So the only reason we were able to tell it was going to I2P is because we cracked open the packets, saw that it's going to I2P, and so, but then that's where the trail basically ended.
Yeah, Andy routinely runs all the traffic through an appliance to decrypt the SSL, and that's when he started seeing this. But the takeaway for this is, here's something that the average good guy has not even heard about. The bad guys had not only heard about it, they said, oh, this could be useful, and they had gone through alpha, beta, and final deployment within a few months, and they were rolling it out and taking advantage of it. That's how fast they moved to take advantage of one of these things that the internet provides for them. Embedded systems.
Okay, so this is a list of CVEs, and they're all really basic, right? Default password of admin, hard-coded telnet passwords, and this is stuff that you would figured, oh, that would be CVEs for like 1995. We'd have that figured out by now, but these are from 2014. Like, this is a problem that happens today, hard-coded admin passwords. And so at Black Hat, there was a So Hopelessly Broken competition where they were looking at home routers. And this is a script kiddie. I think this is Lizard Squad's script, that it would just get on your network and it would just brute force. It didn't even try to detect what modem you had. It would just go to 192.168.0.1 and just try everything.
So it's trying admin as the user account password at the address it expects to find the modem at, and it's just basically trying to set the primary and secondary DNS to the IPs of the bad guy's choosing.
And as you can see, there's thousands of lines in this script. So there's just
each one for a different model of home router or wireless modem. Yes? Yeah, so the comment was they had an infection where the infected computer was running something like this, targeting a bunch of different home routers, trying to find a router and then using 10 different common passwords to try to get in, and it was succeeding about 20% of the time in his data. So this went on for like 4,000 lines, targeting all sorts of different routers. So this is like script. That's not just Lizard Squad. It's other organized groups. Brazil has had problems of banking Trojans where the malware wasn't on the computer. The malware was changing the DNS on the router. So the bad guys were sending you to the bank site and, fake certificates and stuff. So it looked real. Like you knew you had typed your bank in properly because you typed it in and your router sent you there and it looked like the bank, but it's using the router. We don't have time to talk about Inception, but it's an APT group and they used layers of command and control. One of those layers involved hijacked routers they were using as proxies. So we have a couple minutes to talk about some things you can do. If you look at the Dyer sample, that's popular banking malware these days, and it uses SSL, it generates certificates. It doesn't always use port 443. Okay, so you can knock out a third of the traffic just by saying, wait, I'm going to block SSL traffic that isn't on port 443. And that would get some of it. Right? Self-signed certificates would be another one. So that's one of the things you can watch for is, so SSL traffic on a non-standard port, traffic on 443 that isn't SSL, kind of the flip side of that, and then invalid expired self-signed certificates. And because this is happening, the handshaking is happening not in the browser, but in the background, you have to enforce policy at the gateway. So you can have your gateway proxy say, I am not going to allow SSL connections using some of these things. I can break the connection and say, no, that certificate I'm not going to trust. I don't care who's making the connection, we're not going to trust it. Overall, as a recommendation when you're considering security budget, I invest first in people. I'd rather have smart people than a smart box on my team. And I would rather buy solutions that give me visibility into my traffic than buy magic boxes that catch stuff. Okay? And don't click on .science TLDs. Your advice, Chris?
So, on embedded devices? So with embedded devices, the problem is, since it's not a computer with a desktop and you can see what's running on it, most of the time you have no idea what it's doing. And most people don't even look to see what it's doing. Like, how often do you log into your home router and check what your router itself is doing? I mean, when your internet goes down, you log in to see what's going on, but beyond there, probably rarely. And so lots of the times you can gain access to the router and it can just run as much as it wants. And one of the best ways to overcome that is we need to start pressuring manufacturers to think about security overall.
Because if you're like me and you do that, there's a problem, so you do log into your home router, I try to always click the link to say check for updates. Guess how many times I've seen an update for my router? Okay? Unless we pressure the manufacturers, that's not going to change.
And another part of awareness is just going to be telling people, because people that come to hacking conferences, we know all about these horrible security problems, but that's a very small percentage of the population. I mean, look at how popular the car hacking thing when it came out, like at DEF CON and Wired. It was huge, and then GM fixed it.
And yeah, there was a lot of debate about were Chris and Charlie grandstanding? Yeah.
But it worked.
Would the manufacturers and the public have taken it as seriously had they not done that? Arguably no. And so to a certain extent, fortunately or unfortunately, the hackers have to make noise about and do some spectacular things to show off, get enough attention, to get things fixed.
Which also why it's kind of nice that sometimes, like when Heartbleed came out, and it was always a big deal, and news organizations were talking about it.
It's got a cool logo.
And then it got fixed quickly. But most threats don't.
I mean, we like to think that we're smart enough as security guys that when something like Heartbleed comes out, we have time to read the advisory and we say, oh, yeah, that could be serious. Cleaning my schedule today, we're going to patch SSL on all my servers. I hope we're that good, but it helps if there's public outcry and the CEO has seen something about this new internet vulnerability called Heartbleed that's destroying everything, and he's checked in to say, are we vulnerable, right? That makes it much easier to clear your calendar that day and work on patching servers, right? And so there's good stuff to publicity.
Last, you need to get good web intelligence, which is, like we were saying earlier, you need data, and you need people to look at the data.
And they got to know what normal looks like, so they kind of know what they're looking. Okay, we had some questions during the thing, but if there's any of those topics that sounded interesting to you and you wanted, because we covered a lot, if there's any of those that have interest, we're the last talk, so we can stay here and answer questions as long as you guys want to ask questions. But we're not going to make you stay and ask questions. So unless you have questions about these, we're going to stop now. No? Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for sitting through this and being brave and being stalwart individuals. Thank you.